Hello all, in this video I'll be diving into my build, which uses Stormcaller Arrow with a Thunder and Ice Herald combo for map clear, and Siege Cascade with Vine Arrow for bosses. This has no mana or spirit requirements, and electrocutes the boss before it can even move. First, let's go over the map clearing setup, starting with the gameplay. How I play this is by constantly running while spraying Stormcaller Arrows. Whenever a monster gets hit, the double heralds take over and chain kill the pack. Here I'm going for a walk on the beach, on a typical tier 15 map. I constantly fire off Stormcaller Arrows towards where I'm planning to run to next. When the attack speed is high enough, these attacks barely slow down your character while running. The goal is to run non-stop, only stopping to pick up loot. Stormcaller Arrow is the bread and butter of the build. It scales well with area of effect, and has a near guaranteed shock chance, with plus 800% built into the explosion. It also has good damage scaling. At level 20, 109% from the arrow, and another 437% from the explosion. The downside of this skill is that the explosion has a 1.5 second delay. To improve the feel of the skill, I use fast forward, which brings the arrow duration down to 1.05 seconds, which is what you see in the footage. I then use inspiration because I can't be bothered to be chugging mana pots nonstop. For damage, I use martial tempo, primal armament, and rising tempest. Next, I want to briefly explain the double herald setup if you're not familiar. For Herald of Thunder to activate, you need to kill an enemy that is shocked. It will then fire a bolt at the next 5 enemies you hit. For Herald of Ice to activate, you need to freeze the enemy and shatter them. This will create a large ice explosion centered on that enemy. So if your Herald of Thunder freezes enemies, and your Herald of Ice shocks enemies, they will trigger off of each other, causing a chain reaction. The hardest part of this setup is getting enough cold and freeze buildup on Herald of Thunder for it to consistently freeze enemies. In order to accomplish this, I'm using Cold Infusion, Glaciation, Cold Penetration, and Lightning Mastery. I also have cold damage on my bow, quiver, and one of my rings. This puts my cold damage at around 3 to 6,000, and this combined with quite a bit of freeze buildup is about what you need in order for this to proc reliably. Starting out, I would suggest just using the Pulsar Kiln ring. This ring allows you to shatter chilled enemies, which requires hardly any cold damage. The only downside is that it uses up a ring slot with mediocre stats, so eventually it's nice to replace. Now that Herald of Thunder is shattering enemies, the hard part is over. Getting Herald of Ice to shock is much simpler, especially if you're using Hand of Wisdom in action. The core here is to use Lightning Infusion and Conduction. Magnified Effect makes the explosions larger, and Innervate will help with all your damage. Magnified Effect is also quite good on Stormcaller Arrow, so you can mess around with that to see what feels good for you. Next we'll dig into the setup for boss killing, using Siege Cascade and Vine Arrow. Siege Cascade is a crossbow skill, so we'll be making use of the weapon swap to get this to work. It fires a bolt that explodes on every enemy within 3.5 meter radius of your aim. At level 19, it does a respectable 238% attack damage per explosion, and has a 90% more multiplier if the enemy is immobilized, which works for electrocute. The key to this combo is that each plant from Vine Arrow is treated as an enemy. Thus, stacking a large amount of plants and then firing Siege Cascade causes a ridiculous number of explosions. The only thing you need to be careful about is not overdoing it and lagging your game. From my experience, 50 plants is plenty to annihilate most of the bosses. There is a weapon swap bug in the hideout, so I would suggest testing it someplace else. Now, there are no item requirements to get this to work, but I would suggest using Hand of Wisdom in action for flat damage, and then Rampart Raptor, as it bypasses most of the reloads and fires very fast with basically no mana requirement. Rampart Raptor is a very common unique, and only costs 1 Exalt on trade. If you do use a normal crossbow, note that it will use quite a bit of mana. I typically just use my normal bow, but you can swap your normal bow for a Quill Rain for the boss fight in order to place plants faster. As for gems, the most important one for Siege Cascade is Electrocute. This will electrocute the boss quite quickly, which causes your damage to nearly double, and saves you from taking any damage yourself. The rest of the gems are there for damage. I use Close Combat, and right before a boss fight, I'll pull Lightning Infusion, Primal Armament, and Martial Tempo from my other skills. Just remember to put them back after you kill the boss. You may also want to use Magnified Effect if you're fighting a boss that is off the side of a cliff, to make sure that the AoE reaches them. Vine Arrow is just there to create targets for your Siege Cascade, and you don't care about the damage at all, so just use a level 3 gem to lower the mana cost. For supports, I use Concentrated Effect to place the plants closer together, Persistence to have them last longer, Font of Rage for your Siege Cascade to do more damage, and Scattershot to place more plants per attack. And if you want them to glow blue, you can use Font of Mana as well. An important requirement to get this build to work is that you will need about 100 strength and 100 int in order to use the gems required for the build. As for gear, I've already shown everything I feel is critical to the build, but one other piece I highly suggest is Queen of the Forest, which is worth about 5 or 6 div at the time of this video. This allows me to get to around 80% movement speed, which is probably the most important stat in terms of clear speed once you cap resistances and have sufficient damage. The downside is that you can't take acrobatics, but I find the trade-off is worth it since bosses don't get to attack. The gear in the passive tree can be flexed in a lot of ways, but I'll show you what I'm currently using and my thought process behind it. Since I am using Queen of the Forest, evasion is movement speed, so I prioritize that wherever I can. For my bow, I prioritized cold damage to ensure my Herald of Thunder could freeze. Attack speed, as that scales very well with the flat damage from the quiver, hoa, and rings, and additional arrows to increase clear speed. I also find high increased elemental damage is a very strong prefix, even if my bow is only 317 DPS. For the quiver, I went for flat damage, attack speed, and dex. I decided to not use skill levels as I'd rather keep my mana cost low and the damage wasn't required. This also makes the quiver much cheaper. For the helm and boots, I'm looking for high evasion, resistances, attributes, and max health. Since I'm using Queen of the Forest, movement speed on boots does nothing, so you can get some very nice boots for cheap. This build doesn't require any extra spirit, so there's nothing really required on the amulet. Here I'm allocating Primal Growth, which gives 30% extra area of effect if you've killed recently. For the belt I'm using Ingenuity, and for the rings I'm using flat evasion and then the typical flat damage, life, attributes, increased rarity, and resistances. To help keep myself alive, I use Olroth's Resolve, which is currently giving me over a 1300 guard. I combo this with a Ruby, which gives skill mana costs converted to life costs, so that way I can proc it anytime I want. For the Ascendancy tree, I'm going with Tailwind and Extra Projectile. I'm also currently using Point Blank because I find it a little bit better for bossing, but this could also be swapped to Far Shot. Ailment Chance is quite good for this build, since we need it to freeze as well as electrocute for bossing. This is why I went with the attack speed and ailment chance nodes at the beginning. Weapon set 1 has my bow, and weapon set 2 has my crossbow, which is why these quiver effects are only allocated on weapon set 1. I also find that movement speed isn't required for the crossbow since you're just casting Siege Cascade, so there's several instances where I'm only taking the evasion on the bow. Moving up, I take the attack speed and dex nodes, which are useful since we need a lot of stats. I path through the evasion nodes for extra movement speed, and also grab the extra damage while using heralds. I then move up to grab Wildstorm as its significant damage bonus, and for crossbow only, I grab these lightning penetration nodes. This is because many of the pinnacle bosses have 75% resistances. Moving to the bottom of the tree, for bow only, I take these extra evasion nodes, as well as the herald damage and herald area of effect nodes. And here I target Emboldened Avatar since it gives both freeze and electrocute buildup. For crossbow only, I grab Forces of Nature and Flash Storm to finish off my damage penetration. This puts my lightning penetration on Siege Cascade at 74%. I use up the rest of my crossbow only points to get coursing energy for electrocute buildup, as well as Giant Slayer to do extra damage to bosses. At the bottom is where I use my Against the Darkness jewel. I currently have a maximum life and extra damage as lightning. On the right, I take some attack speed nodes, which are extra valuable since they're in the Against the Darkness range, along with the attribute stacking nodes on the bottom. These help out at getting the attribute requirements to use all the gems, and Jack of all trades is actually a pretty huge damage bonus since we have at least 100 of each attribute. On the left here, I take all of the area effect nodes, which impact Stormcaller Arrow, Herald of Ice, as well as Siege Cascade. I've honestly been neglecting my jewels a little bit, but here's what I'm currently using. One thing to remember is that bonuses gained from equipped quiver does not help you with bossing. I'll have a Mobalytics link with my build in the description. If you have any questions or ideas for the build, you can hit me up in the comments. I'll leave it off with a bit of breach footage, and if you could help me out with the algo gods, I'd definitely appreciate it.